Good evening, members. Apologies for the slightly delayed start. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Audit, Governance and Standards Committee. I have been advised that there are no planned fire drills tonight, but if the alarm does sound, Mrs Snook will ascertain the situation and provide further instructions. I would remind you that this meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Maidstone Borough Council website, but will anyone else be recording or filming the proceedings? I ask so that people at the meeting will know if this is happening. Members who are using mobile phones and tablets are asked to please ensure that these are on silent and are only being used with regard to business on the agenda this evening. Agenda item 1, apologies for absence. I've received apologies for absence from Councillors Cox, McLaughlin, Round and Fissenden. Notification of substitute members.
Councillor English for Councillor Cox.
Councillor Black.
Councillor Mrs Blackmore for Councillor McLaughlin.
Thank you. Urgent items, there are none. Notification of visiting members, there are none. Disclosures by members and officers. Are there any? No. Disclosures of lobbying. Has anyone got any disclosures? No. Item number 7, exempt information. I move that the items on the agenda be taken in public as proposed. Minutes of the meeting held on the 30th of July 2019. I will take these minutes page by page. So starting with page 1. Are we happy that's correct? Page 2. Page 3. Page 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. 11. And finally 12. Perfect.
They're all agreed.
Yep, all agreed. Thank you.
Jen, sorry, did you disclosures? I know you did lobbying.
We did. Do you want to go back to that?
Yeah, please. I wasn't sure you did that one.
Apologies. So just to clarify, disclosures by members and officers, are there any disclosures to be made this evening? No, there are none. No. Agenda item number 9, questions and answers from members of the public. There are no questions for this evening. Agenda item 10, committee work programme. This is on page 13. Are there any comments on this? No. Moving on to agenda item 11, annual complaints report. Mr. Mundell, can you introduce this for me, please?
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. So this report covers service complaints received in the financial year 2018-19. So for members of the committee and for any members of the public watching, this does not include complaints against councillors. So I believe that's being covered in a report later tonight. So I just wanted to make that distinction. So this is just service complaints. So the council received 568 stage 1 complaints and 109 stage 2 complaints within 2018-19, so a total of 677. Overall, the number of complaints has decreased by 22% from last year. Now, last year we did see an unusually high number of complaints, so the figure is now comparable with that of 2016-17. So I'll just go through a little bit about what the report says and the different stages of the process. So with stage 1 complaints, at Appendix 1 you can see the stage 1 complaints by service. Now for the first time we were able to analyse these by category of complaint and by decision on the complaint, so whether it was upheld or not. Now there are 6 categories outlined at paragraph 3.5 in the covering report, and we found the largest proportion, which is 40%, are about a policy or a decision that we have made. Now we upheld 31.9% of our complaints at stage 1. And in terms of timeliness, 95.2% were responded to within 10 working days, which is what's defined as in time in our policy. And the average time to respond was 4.5 days. Now, both of these are an improvement on the previous year, so it's showing good positive performance in terms of responses. Now, moving on to second stage complaints, Appendix 2 shows a list of these by service. So 19.2%, which represents 109 of the stage 1 complaints, were escalated compared to 14.8% last year. And the majority, 70% of these complaints, were again about a policy or a decision. Now, this is expected, but the proportion has increased compared to those stage 1 complaints. So at stage 2, we upheld 16.5% of the complaints, or 18. We also assessed 31% as being justified. So this is where the stage 1 response isn't adequate or has raised further concerns or questions for the customer. And 90% or 90.8% of the stage 2s were responded to in time. And the average time taken was 19.3 days. Now, these have both dropped slightly, but we're obviously still quite positive figures to see, to be in the 90%, and like I say, to have the average time under that 20 working day mark. So in terms of the services themselves, those with the highest complaint volumes were waste, parking, council tax, and development management. Now, these also had the highest levels of stage 2 escalations, along with planning enforcement. Now, this is to be expected, but the addition of planning enforcement in this is likely due to the contentious nature of the issues that are being complained about, but we haven't noticed any specific trend in terms of the reason for those escalations. So, paragraph 6 of the report identifies next steps to improve the management of complaints. Now, some of these are recurring from last year, but it is important to note that we have continued to improve quality, particularly in areas where we had previously identified certain issues. So although they look the same, we are on a sort of positive path and we are improving. So as well as the next steps identified in the report, we will also be reviewing the complaints process as a whole. Now, this will firstly focus on escalations and looking at whether at stage 2, whether a full investigation of a complaint would actually add value. Now, this would introduce essentially a triage process where we can conduct a quicker assessment without delaying the customer if they wish to proceed to the LGO, which is the local government ombudsman. So that is quite similar to a process they actually have in place at the moment, whereby the ombudsman will make an initial assessment of a complaint, and they may either decide not to investigate it or they might allocate it to an investigator. So it's essentially a smaller scale version of that process. Secondly, we'll also be looking at giving training and guidance to service managers on specific topics to look at improving complaints handling across the organisation and reducing the numbers of complaints, complaint escalations, and ultimately those that then get escalated to the Ombudsman. So that brings me on to part 7 of the report, which does look at the Ombudsman's letter. And so this also refers to a public report, which is where they make a report about a specific complaint. So this was a housing complaint, the decision to which was issued in February and presented to full council in July. So the council complied with all the recommendations made by the LGO, and the LGO's full letter can be found at Appendix 4. So in terms of the 9 complaints that went to the LGO, 33% of them were upheld, again, which is an improvement on last year, so it continues the sort of positive trends that we're seeing. Now, these 3 complaints were in the areas of parking, development management, and the housing complaint, which I just mentioned. So that concludes my introduction to the report. Obviously, the recommendation on this is to note the contents of the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much for that brilliant introduction. Councillor Davis.
Well, Chairman, I try to be one of the most patient people in the world from time to time, but I have to tell you it's been very stretched today. I've been through the process of trying to telephone this wonderful organisation twice. On the first occasion, it took me nearly 40 minutes to get through to the person I wanted to speak to. On the second occasion, 25 minutes. So that's over an hour and a quarter of my time wasted today trying to get through on the telephone service. And I noticed that it comes under technical in this report, calls and one thing and another. I just invite anybody who works here to try and telephone from outside. And I stuck with it today just to make sure that I understood exactly how long it took for people to get through. The fact I was doing it on my mobile phone, it probably cost me a fortune. But this is the system. And many, many times when you do actually get through to wherever you want, you get an answer, leave a message. And leave a message can serve you right, but on the other hand, it probably won't serve you right if you wait long enough for the people to ring you back. So on one occasion only, when I hadn't had a reply from somebody 3 times in a week, I did phone up somebody else and say, is this person alive still? And I was told they were on maternity leave. So you can understand the frustration. It doesn't tell you anything. If you send, of course, an email, you might get an out-of-the-office reply. But all I'm saying to you is that the telephone service which we've got at the moment, serving the public, first of all, you have a long introduction by somebody or other telling you, press this, press that, press the other. And when you get through to that press, then you've got another thing behind it with another whole press system. And it really is infuriating. And so all I'm saying is that if we want to be seen to be efficient, I think we're going to have to smarten up our telephone system. Now, I've said this many times. I've been around a long time. We used to have 3 telephone operators with wires and things that were sitting in front of them. And then, Mr. Green, in your position now, that the original chap that was in there, we had a key performance indicator. If that telephone rang more than 3 times, he wanted to know why. So all I'm saying to you is it rings a lot more than 3 times now, and the time spent behind it trying to get through to anybody is a nightmare. So I'm saying this is an official complaint from me, but do try on occasions just to phone yourself from outside and see what happens, but because I can tell you that. And the website is not much better. The website, you can go round and round and round the circles, and a lot of people are not very used to using websites. And unless we smarten it up and sharpen it and make it simpler for people to use, I don't think we're doing ourselves any service. So there we are. Chairman, I'm sorry to be such a misery, but there you go.
Thank you. Councillor Ing.
Generally, it's not a bad situation, generally speaking. I take it that perhaps some of the improvement has been down to the fact that a few years ago, certainly, we were recording basically what were queries about services as complaints, presumably stage 1 complaints, when actually there were more in the nature of inquiries. So presumably we sorted out that category thing. But I would, just in passing, make an observation that I am surprised that the number of technical complaints is so low. Having noticed quite a number of issues with attempting to report things such as environmental health issues through the website, and the whole thing was actually directing environmental health complaints to entirely the wrong department. I'm surprised that the complaints are so low. That issue, I think, has been addressed, but it is noticeable that actually trying to get the right complaint to the right department, or the right service inquiry to the right department using the website is incredibly difficult, apart from certain aspects of the planning system, and parking can be quite good too, but there are a lot of problems with it. So I'm really staggered it's as low as 20, that number of complaints is as low as it is. On the plus side, I'm pleased to see that despite quite a high level of complaints in relation to planning and enforcement, there's a very low level of those complaints being upheld, which is pleasing to see. So overall encouraging, but I think we, as Councillor Daly said, we do really need to look at that website because frankly, there is a possibility where we're actually not getting some complaints through because people just give up and go away because they can't submit them to the right place anyway.
Thank you. Mr Green, do you want to come back on any of those points?
Oh,
Yes, I'd be very happy to come back, particularly on Councillor Daly's point on the phones. And I'm sorry to hear what you've said about the two calls today, because we definitely want customers to have a positive experience when they contact us. And I see and discuss with the customer services manager on a regular basis the stats that we keep, because we do monitor the number of phone calls that are dropped and the time that it takes to answer them. I would say that there are other channels for reaching the council. So going back to the days that you were describing, nowadays people can reach us by email, and if you know the officer who you need to talk to, or if you know the department and our email address, you can do that. Also, I don't know whether you were calling the general phone number. Obviously, if you have a direct line for the officer you want to reach, you should be able to get through, and at the very least, if they don't pick the call up, you'll get a voicemail, so you can leave a message. So, I mean, I can't justify the wait that you had with those two calls, but I would reassure you that it is something that we look at very closely, and we provide a range of different ways that people can get through, which I hope would mitigate any delay. And just on the website, I mean, as Councillor English knows, I think we do have a regular dialogue with councillors about the website. It's under continual development. We maintain it in-house, so we can tweak it and adapt it in response to any issues that people may have. So I'd encourage you to raise any points that you have on the website. Thank you.
Councillor Atkinson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just before I go into what I was going to say, picking up on Councillor Daly's point, I mean, when you Google Maidstone Borough Council, it comes up on the page which says the Mayor is Mr Greer and the leader is Councillor Wilson, which is slightly out of date. So maybe that needs to be updated in some way. But anyway, to go on to what I was going to talk about, on our report here, it's not 100% clear what these colours are on page 18, because it's all in grey. So I wonder if, as we produce our reports in black and white, maybe we should sort of do some sort of hatching or some system so that the colours, in inverted commas, come out more clearly, so it's more obvious what they refer to. So that's one point. And on page 21, it's good to note there's a 33% reduction in waiting time, so that is a real good bit of progress. Going on to page 24, this is possibly a mathematical thing. It says the upheld rate has decreased by 9%. Well, in actual fact, it's increased by 9 percentage points, but the reduction is 21.4%. So maybe we should emphasise the actual reduction is 21.4%. It makes our figures look much better, and it's still actually factual. So maybe that's something to bear in mind for the future, because 9 percentage points is different from 21.4%. Page 25, we've got the table. It's got the column for compliments, but I've no idea what those other two columns are in that graph. So maybe we could have an explanation as to what those are all about. And I now have a question. I mean, we pay compensation from time to time. Do we know how much money we actually pay out in compensation per year? So I'd like to know that, and if it's recorded in any way at all, and if not, perhaps it should be recorded. So perhaps I could have an answer to some of those questions. Thank you.
Mr Munden, can you come back, please?
So just quickly on the graph that you referenced, I think those columns are just in there accidentally, because I did notice this earlier when I looked at it. So they're not actually supposed to be in it at all. So it might just be a transposition of data error. So that's that bit out of the way. In terms of compensation, so I did look up, for the year 18-19, I looked at the compensation that was offered. And this includes the LGO payment that we'd made as well. So there was a total of £723 of monetary compensation that was offered in 18-19. Just a small breakdown of that. So at stage 1, there was only one complaint, which was offered £100, which was a partial refund of an application. And then the rest of that was at stage 2, obviously minus the 250 at LGO. Just as a sort of addition to that, it isn't just monetary compensation that we offer. We also offer remedies in terms of, so we'll extend people's garden waste bins subscriptions. So if they've had disruption to their garden waste, we won't necessarily refund them. We'll extend their subscription so that they get an extra few months, depending on the level of disruption. Or we'll waive fees for services if they need a review, or we might waive a planning application fee, for example. And in one case, we did actually provide HAZLIT tickets it was a non-monetary gesture just to show our apology, basically. So I think the £723, although that is just monetary, there are other sort of things we can offer which aren't necessarily just a financial payment. I have been speaking to Chris, who sat next to me, just about how we can make sure we're actually recording this properly in the future. So we record it in my team when we offer the remedy, but what we're going to encourage, and it will be part of the advice and guidance that we're offering service managers, is if we can get them to reference the word compensation or complaint when they're actually putting the payment through, because as I understand it, we can then do a search and find all of the compensation payments that we've made, and that was something we did recently, but it only brought payments up for this year, as in 19-20. So that is something we can encourage going forward, so that we can actually see, one, where it's offered, and then cross-reference that to where they have actually accepted and we've paid out. Because we might find that figure of 723 might be lower where people have rejected our offer of compensation. So that's one way that we've looked at perhaps addressing that in the future, and just doubling up and making sure we're recording everything correctly.
Councillor Blackmore.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sorry, Councillor Atkinson. I have Googled, other search engines are available, Maidstone Borough Council, and the Mayor is definitely listed as Councillor Marion Ring. So maybe it was an old Google page, but I can assure you I picked the first one that comes up, and it clearly says that. On a different note, I think this report is interesting because the service that has the highest number of complaints is waste. They also have the highest number of compliments. And clearly it is a service that touches everybody in this borough on a weekly basis. So let's hear it for the compliments, shall we? Slightly disappointing that you list them for 2018-19, but I don't know how that compares to the previous year, or whether this is something we're just starting to do. On the complaints side, I think sometimes we're very good at just beating ourselves up. But actually, I think if you put it into perspective about the numbers of contacts that we have with our residents on a daily basis, the number of complaints is actually a very, very small number. And I think sometimes that can become skewed. So I would actually like to say, complaints, no one wants a complaint. The fact that they've all been dealt with pretty successfully, I think everyone deserves a pat on the back. I think we need to be a little bit more positive about the number of complaints. But what I would like to know is how this compares with other boroughs. Are we in, say, the top quartile in the country, for example? Are we in the bottom quartile? Where do we actually sit? And my second question is, I thought 2 years ago we changed the way that complaints were reported. So as soon as someone says, I don't like X, it is treated as a complaint. Whereas I think prior to that, we were a little bit, oh, let's wait for something a bit more concrete. So I think we actually treat it in quite a strict way. And maybe another organisation looking at something coming in might look at it and say, no, that's not a complaint. So 2 questions. How do we compare? And I think we changed the reporting system, didn't we?
So just on how we compare, I know in the previous report we compared to our SIPFA nearest neighbours. We did try and get that data for this report as well. Obviously there are differences in, like you say, how people or what people actually consider to be a complaint, and that can cause some issues, but we still tend to take it as generally the definition should be roughly the same. But we just didn't have enough data to actually draw a good comparison. So we've had a few who have logged it as sort of FOIs rather than dealing with it as general queries. So that's obviously caused some delays in actually getting data back from them. But it is a benchmarking exercise that we're going to continue, even sort of, even though it didn't make it into the report, it is still something we want to compare against, because it can be quite a good news story, particularly if you're in the upper sections of that list. And we tend to find we do have shorter response times, as in our time scale for responding, but actually our performance usually is quite a lot better. So we're hoping it sort of draws the same conclusions this time, but we are still waiting for some of the data back on that, so that we do have a full comparison rather than comparing against sort of dribs and drabs of information that we have come back. I've forgotten your second question, sorry.
Second question relates to, as I say, the actual complaints, and I thought we'd changed how we how certain things came in. So we tend to err on the side of caution, whereas other organisations might be a little bit more, oh, that's not a complaint. Yes, we'll deal with that quite quietly.
Mr. Munden, would you like to come back in?
So when we revamped our complaints policy, I think it was a couple of years ago, like you said, we made the definition quite clear in that it's dissatisfaction with a service. So we're strict in that sense, in that, if somebody's bin is missed, we won't report that as a complaint, because there is a route they can go down. Similarly, parking appeals, things like that, where the outcome is available via a different route. So it's normally a judicial or appeals process route. We wouldn't necessarily take it as a complaint. But if somebody is expressing dissatisfaction with a service they have received, or an interaction with the council or a member of staff, that's when it's reported as a complaint. So we do tend to be quite strict, but we try and weigh up, how quickly are they going to get the outcome that they want? Is the complaints process the best way to do it? Is that actually going to delay them in getting what they need? And actually, could it be answered just as easily as a query or a question? And actually, they build a better relationship with the service, rather than forcing them down an official route where they receive an acknowledgement and a reference number. It's not always the best way to deal with it. So we do with it sort of a little bit fluidly, but we do have quite a solid policy sort of backing us up, so we can make those decisions.
Sorry, Chairman, if I can. So effectively, you're carrying out a triage process. It's exactly what would happen if you went into A&E. They would triage you to work out who's urgent and who isn't. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But I also think there's another issue when you said it could be dealt with as a query. I don't know whether the queries process on the website is actually simple enough. And I think that relates a little bit to Councillor Daly's question about the website. I think it's easy to find, but sometimes when you've got to go through screen, after a while, you do get a little bit impatient. So maybe that could be looked at, just to make sure that, we're not missing anyone who is out there. But even so, I think there are lots of compliments, and I think we should be pleased about that too.
Thank you. One other quick question for you. You mentioned at the start about the complaint that the LGO had referred back to us in February. Now that doesn't show in this report here, does it? Because it comes under this year, I believe. Is that correct?
No, so that will be in this report. That's it's one that they refer to in their letter on Appendix 4. Obviously, because of the delay between the end of year and this meeting, the dates can be a bit confusing, but that is one that falls in the 18-19 year, but obviously we only reported it to council within this financial year.
And so how many complaints have we currently got with the LGO as things stand at the moment?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know it's single figures. It may be around 3 or 4, but I'd have to check to be certain.
Councillor English.
I mean, it doesn't happen very often, but the final resort to a complaint in one way can be a judicial review of the council's actions. We're going through the High Court. It doesn't happen very often, but would it be correct to include that somewhere as a report, whether it's in the complaints report or not? Because after all, it is effectively a complaint, albeit a very serious one, through the High Court rather than through our internal complaints process.
Mr. Green.
We don't treat that as part of the complaints process as defined in the policy. I take your point that ultimately people might have to have recourse to legal action, but the final stage from the point of view of the policy is the referral to the local government ombudsman. So take your point, but that's the final stage as defined here.
Clearly, whilst it doesn't happen very often, the final outcome of a planning camp, particularly planning complaints, can be that. So I just wondered whether it's something to think about, how that's treated in reporting back to the public.
One other question as well, then, as we're previously talking about the LGO. We've got 3 complaints in this report that were upheld by the LGO. You mentioned one of them earlier. What were the details around the other 2?
I thought I had this, but I don't. I believe the parking one was where we'd issued a PCN and we'd sort of put the customer back through the appeals system. So they'd reached a certain point within the appeals system, and then there was an administrative error, and then we basically put them back through that system, which obviously caused some delay and some distress. So they recognised that that had delayed him. And I can't remember what the planning one was, but I can, like I say, if you do need to know, I can have a look and get back to you.
Thank you. Right, if there are no other questions, we'll turn to the recommendations on page 15. Which are that the Council's performance on complaint management in 2018-19 and the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman Review Letter be noted. Is that noted, members? Noted. Thank you. Moving on then to agenda item 12 on page 37. Mrs. Narrable, can you please introduce?
The report provides an update to the Committee on Complaints received under the Members' Code of Conduct from 15th of January 2019. Paragraph 3 of this report also outlines the results of an investigation regarding the release of exempt information contrary to the Local Government Act, Schedule 12A. The committee is asked to note the recommendations. Paragraph 2.6 of the report notes that since the last report, Audit and Governance, on 14th of January, there have been 5 parish council complaints. And you will see at paragraph 2.6 the type of issues considered within those complaints. They range from allegations of inappropriate dealing with the parish planning committee. That particular complaint failed one of the local or legal jurisdiction tests. There was further complaint about aggressive and rude behaviour at a parish council meeting. There was an informal resolution for that particular complaint, and the subject member undertook training. The other complaint related to inappropriate dealings in a planning matter against 2 subject members. The matter was informally resolved, and again, training was involved. There was a further parish council complaint dealing with verbal assault and aggression, and we're currently awaiting the outcome of that particular investigation. And the final parish council complaint dealt with the data protection breach. That particular complaint failed the local assessment criteria, and the complaint was rejected. So there was only one particular complaint against a borough councillor, and that related to the disclosure of confidential information, and the issue was dealt with by way of a mediation meeting between the parties concerned, and resolved that way. Paragraph 3 deals with the release of, it was really regarding the issue of release or the leaking of exempt information contained within a P&R, Policy and Resources Committee report to the press. By a majority vote, the Policy and Resources Committee had decided to go into exempt session and had decided therefore to consider the matter on a confidential basis. As a result of the release of the information to the press, the monitoring officer and the chief executive decided that an investigation would be appropriate, and an experienced investigator was appointed. The investigation report is appended at page 43 of this particular report. Now, the purpose of the investigation was really to enable the monitoring officer to review actions taken by officers and members to determine whether indeed there had been a breach and the requirements of the Local Government Act 1972, Schedule 12A, had been breached. The report also notes that actually there had been previous earlier guidance in January 2019 regarding councillor press briefings and dealing with the press, and this was provided to members. There was also further guidance on the 21st of January 2019 about dealing with confidential and exempt information. So in light of all of these earlier guidances and a result of this particular release, it was considered appropriate that an investigation be started, and we were asked whether, you know, we had appropriate delegation and authority to proceed that investigation, and clarification was provided that the monitoring officer and chief executive did have authority within the Constitution, and indeed it's the monitoring officer's role to provide support and guidance to this particular committee, and that is why the report is being referred to this committee. So, if a breach is generally established, this could result in disciplinary action against an officer or a formal code of conduct against a councillor if indeed a breach is established. So all committee members and those present at the Policy and Resources Committee on 22nd of May, to include visiting members, were invited to be interviewed, and all officers present were also interviewed. All officers participated, and the majority of members who were interviewed. However, 3 members declined. 3 members that were present at the Policy and Resources meeting declined to take part. So none of the officers and members interviewed admitted to releasing the exempt information. So the conclusion reached following the investigation is that no evidence emerged to identify who may have leaked the exempt information to the press. However, it was established that there was one press release by a member to the Downs Mail on 23rd of May, but the press article did not contain exempt information. So on a balance of probabilities, we just couldn't identify who released the exempt information to the press. Now, the potential damages of release of such exempt information is outlined on page 47, so I'll leave that to members to consider in detail. But they range from, bringing the authority into disrepute. The members indeed can bring themselves into disrepute as well. There could be data protection breaches. Third-party rights could be affected, which may compromise the council's ability to successfully negotiate on behalf of the council and the wider community. There could be legal proceedings, as a result of these releases, and this may have an impact on the ability of the council to successfully settle claims. So those are the possible outcomes when confidential information is released. The recommendations for the future are outlined at paragraph 9 of the report, page 48. So I'll just leave that for you to think about, but the recommendations are as outlined in the report for this committee to consider. The recommendations are for noting. So they relate to, in relation, pardon me? Sorry. Okay, so the cause of actions that the council can take in relation to the disclosure of exempt information is outlined under paragraph 9. So this entails members and officers could be asked to sign a confidentiality agreement, training in relation to dealing with media, and democratic services could put in place tighter controls on the return of exempt papers, and various other things. However, the recommendations that's been put to this particular committee are outlined on page 37, and this involves a training course to be made available to members on media training. Officers will be provided with training from democratic services on how to structure reports to minimize the information required to be taken in part 2 of a meeting. Regular meetings with communications will be offered to all group leaders to review, plan and schedule public relations as appropriate for council activities, and tighter controls of exempt information via name checking of information after a meeting. And this will be implemented by democratic services. Chair, if you are, I can deal with any further questions if the committee has any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor English.
Before we go on any further, I must... this report is not for noting. It clearly sets out in part 2 of the recommendations on page 37 for specific recommendations for action, not just noting, action by parts of this council. I've said this before many, many times. We often have at committee reports that say for noting when that is not the decision that is being asked for. So can we please actually say that that change this recommendation because it is that then the contents of the report be noted, that's all right in part 1, and that as a result of the investigation into the release of exempt information, the following actions to help manage the task will be taken. In other words, it be noted, be deleted from the second resolution, because we are asking for 4 specific actions to be taken, not just to note the report. Now, I would say I welcome those recommendations. I made a bit of a pain of myself, in particular in relation with recommendation little Roman 3 here. And I welcome this, because with a bit of restructuring we can minimise the dispute, because clearly what we don't want are portmanteau resolutions that require us to put things into Part 2 that don't necessarily have to be in Part 2. And if the council and its committees and its members and its officers are seen to be as transparent as possible with information, and clearly, as the legal officer points out, there are occasions when you simply can't be transparent with information, and the report picks out some fine examples of that. But I think it would be in the best interest of everyone if we're as transparent as possible, and clearly recommendation little Roman 3 is a very good attempt at trying to structure our reports and recommendations in such a way as that will become possible, and that will minimise any risk to the council's reputation. I would observe on the parishes that on the surface it appears to be a slightly worrying trend, but actually because I have been involved with parish councils in Maidstone for many years, I have some knowledge of what these complaints actually are. And I'd have to say that, by and large, they arise out of particular situations in a handful of parishes, but situations that are recurring. But it doesn't necessarily represent a trend favourably or unfavourably for parishes across the board. It refers to a small number of people who have personal conflicts in those parishes, and they are using the complaint system as a way of continuing that conflict over certain small p political issues. So I would say we shouldn't read too much into that in terms of a trend indicator.
Mrs. Narenborough, is there anything you'd like to come back on?
Apologies. The amendments to the recommendations will be accepted, so we will incorporate the amendments to the recommendations.
Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. When I read the bit about parish councillors, I thought, my goodness, it's quite dangerous being a parish councillor, and I am still one myself, so I was slightly worried when I read that. But actually, I totally agree with what Councillor English has just said, to be honest. It's because parish councils tend to meet on a slightly more informal basis. People have been there a long time. It tends to be slightly different. So, and I think I wouldn't get too worried about that. I think most parish councils do operate very well. My own one operates, and I know Boxley, because that Councillor Brindle's sitting next to me, we operate on a very formal basis. So I'm not terribly worried about that. What I would come back to is the report on the information, the leaking of the exempt information. When I read it, I mean, to be honest, I love leak inquiries. I've been involved with them so many now. And, I mean, they are a civil servant's way of getting rid of a problem, which is what they always are. I'm sorry to say, be blunt about it. So we ended up with a 6-page report. I think 5 of the pages I could have written myself, because I know exactly what it was all about. And the only line that really mattered was on page 46, which I haven't got my glasses on me, but it's no evidence merged to identify the officer or person who leaked the exempt information. Well, I could tell that right from the start. You know, I could have written that as the opening sentence of this report. You know, I realise the sentiment behind writing it. And the person who did it did a very good job of making something out of nothing, quite frankly. It's a very clever piece of work, but most of it, I said, was already known. And I don't need to be told a lot of the stuff, particularly on page 47. I've found that slightly, not insulting, but we are grown-up people and we're elected members and we have our own responsibility. And I don't need to be told to sign confidential agreements. There's no way I would do that, and I'll tell you that now. Not because I will leak exempt information, but just a point of principle, quite frankly. So I think the report was a bit of a hospital pass that was the poor person who was given it to write, and I think it really was a bit of a waste of time, quite frankly. But then most leak inquiries are, so that's neither here nor there. But as to the recommendations, I do, but actually, and I agree with Councillor English about the noting and the approving. But point 2.2 is very good, I think, actually, if I'm reading it right. I better put my glasses on, otherwise I should probably confuse everybody here. But because I think the structure of the reports and what should be in part 2 and what should be in part 1 is very, very important, actually, because it is, and it's understandable. You want to play safe, so you put a lot of stuff in part 2, which actually should really be in part 1, I think, and from a transparency perspective. So I think that's very important. So I do certainly go along with that. In fact, I can go along with pretty well all the recommendations, I think, interestingly enough. As I say, I think they could have been written without actually bothering with the leak inquiry report, if you want my honest opinion. And so I'll stop there. But I have no problem with the recommendations themselves. I think the report, with due respect, was, okay, a box-ticking exercise that people have to do. But don't take it too seriously, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Just picking up then on your point about the recommendations, as has already been said, the remit to this committee is to look at this type of exempt information leak, potentially. Some of these recommendations do touch on the remit of Democracy and General Purposes Committee. Members, do you see any concern or issue with us perhaps referring some of these to Democracy and General Purposes to consider in the wider context?
I don't have a problem with that, personally. I think it's probably the right process, actually. I should have said that. And I think you're absolutely right, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, members, if that's the case, I suggest we add a third recommendation to this, which is that the recommendations for the future, the recommendations on page 48 under recommendations for the future are referred to the Democracy and General Purposes Committee to review. Seconded? Okay. Before we proceed on with that, then, Councillor Daly.
I don't want to prolong this, Chairman, but I've been around a long time, and it was always impressed upon me from day one that there were certain papers, either yellow papers or green papers, depending on where you were in which authority, which were exempt in the sense of having sensitive information upon them. The time to decide whether it goes into part 2 is the debate that's supposed to take place before the decision is made to put them into part 2. Having made that opportunity to debate whether or not the information on the paper should go into part 2, if we're to listen to the mantra at the moment, the people have spoken, then we're talking about democracy here with a vote. Now, I note I don't belong to the Policy and Resources Committee, but I can read the fact that 4, 11, 3 against and 1 abstention. It just so happens that the 3 against might have been the same 3 that said, no, I'm not going to be investigated. So if you've got 3 people who didn't want to be investigated, they can't tell untruths because they never given the opportunity to do so. So, I mean, we've come back to this business again. I don't know who leaked it, but all I do know is this, that there are occasions when there are commercial opportunities between the council and other people, where it is essential that the particulars are kept in, as it were, under wraps because of the commercial sensitivity of it. Now, in this particular case, we were talking about call for sites. And a call for sites is a free-for-all. You know jolly well we say call for site. Everybody comes in with their 2 penneth of grass that they want to build on. And it's only a call for sites, it doesn't mean anything at all, until it's gone through due process in the planning system to decide which sites are capable of being developed or not. So until that time, it is sensible, is it not, to shut up about it. So, I mean, I see this, and I'm fully in agreement with these recommendations on the papers today. But I think it's about time that some members were told that there is a sanction within the capability of the council if there is financial loss to the council. Individuals who are discovered to have been in breach of this injunction as to keep quiet could be and should be surcharged. It would make their eyes water and their bank balances shrink a bit. And I think that they ought to be told of their responsibility. So I agree with Councillor Perry. We don't want to have people signing the Official Secrets Act. I mean, that's a bit silly, isn't it? But we don't want to go down another route. But we've got to understand that people are asked to be to have some integrity when it comes to these votes. The time to start thinking about whether something should be in Part 2 is the debate that takes place before it is actually placed in. And I hope that that is agreement with the learned counsel on my right and the half a learned counsel on my left. So, you know, I mean, anyway, we talks in legalese, but the point is, I do hope that's what I would call the common sense and the simple part of our business is to make sure that we learn what the rules are and stick by them. It's not a case of, I don't like it, so I'm going to do it. Once the vote has been taken, come back to it. The people have spoken. Finish. So there we go. I fully endorse these recommendations, Chairman, and I think it's about time that they were made more plain to some members of the Council. Thank you.
Councillor Blackmore.
Thank you, Chairman. I do agree with you, actually, Councillor Daly. I think there is an element of integrity. However, unfortunately, there will always be people who want to break the rules because they see everything as suspicious. Well, yeah, maybe they are, but I think some of the members need to stop treating some of the information or some of the officers with suspicion as if they're the enemy. You know, at the end of the day, we're all meant to be working for the same purpose, although sometimes I do wonder. I'd actually like to make a suggestion, Chairman, if I may. On page 37, I know you mentioned you wanted to add a point 3. Could we possibly change the first part of point 2 so it reads that the following be approved rather than noted, because it has been noticed that we need to be a little bit more positive, that the following be approved as a result of the investigation into the release of exempt information, full stop. Actions to help manage the risks will be taken, which are, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. If anybody would be happy to approve that, because then that way it's a decision rather than we've noted something by the back door and no one's noticed. And I'd be grateful if you could read your language for point 3 again, because I just didn't hear any of it.
Apologies. Yeah, that's
I'm so
fine.
sorry.
We can read that again. So the wording for that's fine. The wording for number 3 was the recommendations on page 48 and 37 are referred to the Democracy and General Purposes Committee to review how they are implemented. But we can now amend that so it's just page 37, because of course page 37 supersedes it. So we can just amend it so that the recommendations on page 37 are referred to the Democracy and General Purposes Committee to review how they are implemented. Are we happy to accept Councillor Blackmore's? Oh,
I did press it, but it didn't come on for some reason. I just don't see what it adds to simply deleting, which was originally I suggested, and the officer was accepted it. We just delete that it be noted because everything else is said already. And in terms of your final thing, I agree with it. It's just you don't need to say on page 37 if you're adding it to the recommendation on page 37. You just say that the recommendations are referred to. It's just superfluous to say it twice, that's all. The recommendations are referred to the Democracy Committee for their input, or for consideration rather.
Councillor Blackmore, are you formally moving your proposed wording?
Yes, Chairman, I am.
Do we have a seconder? Yep.
Sorry, can I just clarify this? Sorry, for recommendation 2, is the gist of it basically that as a result of the investigation into the release of exempt information, the following actions should be taken to help manage the risks? And then, is that?
I have already moved that. I have already moved that.
All right, okay, thank you. Okay, so point 2 would read that the following be approved as a result of the investigation into the release of exempt information, full stop, and then actions to help manage the risks will be taken, which are. It just makes it more positive.
Correct, because you're repeating the same phrase twice, but there you go. Meaning is understandable, but you don't need to say that you're taking an action and therefore you're taking action.
Right, as it has been proposed and seconded, we'll go to the vote. Members, those of you in favour of the proposed wording? So we're going to the vote on Councillor Blackmore's proposed wording. Do you want to read it out once more for us?
Okay, so point 2 will read that the following be approved as a result of the investigation into the release of exempt information, full stop. Actions to help manage the risks will be taken, which are, and then there are the 4 points which are listed on page 37.
Members, so we're going to move to the vote on that now. Those in favour of adopting the proposed wording? Yep. Anyone against that? Right, so how many are abstaining? Can we raise your hands, please? 2. Right, so you're saying you're abstaining from that vote then? On the amendment.
Chair, if the earlier amendment has been withdrawn and we're taking a vote on this particular motion, then the decision can be taken on that basis, and the amendments as suggested will be incorporated. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Can I just clarify as well that members agree recommendation 1, that the contents of the report be noted, and that they agree the third recommendation that the chairman. Okay.
Right, okay, so if we've agreed then Councillor Blackmore's proposed wording for number 2, we'll then take the full recommendations now. So we've got 1, that the contents of the report be noted. Recommendation 2, which is as Councillor Blackmore just read out, which was that the following be approved as a result of the investigation into the release of exempt information. Actions to help manage the risks will be taken as follows, and then the 4 points below. And then recommendation 3 is that the recommendations are referred to the Democracy and General Purposes Committee to review how they are implemented. Are those all agreed? Agreed. Moving on then to agenda item 13. Mr. Rowland, can you please introduce?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. So my report this evening sets out the proposed amendments in order to address the recommendations set out in the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office report following their inspection in June 2018. In November 2018, this committee was asked to approve the following recommendations: that RIPA training is carried out for all relevant officers at regular intervals, and that the central record and the covert surveillance and access to communication data policy be amended to reflect the recommendations set out in the inspector's report. These recommendations have now been incorporated into the revised draft policy and the central record, and RIPA training was carried out in April 2019 by an external training provider, ActNow, and delivered to relevant officers. This report seeks the committee's approval of the amendments, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Councillor English.
Well, I may be going barking mad, and it's quite possible, but I thought we had some mobile cameras. And the item 11, CCTV and technical equipment, says a local service covers Maidstone Town Centre only. Well, I'm certain that we have got some mobile CCTV cameras, and I would have thought that, given that it's likely to be that any use of covert surveillance is actually not going to be the town centre CCTV cameras, actually, because they're hardly covert or hideable, it's far more likely that if we are doing covert surveillance, it would be, not that we do very much of it, but we have in the past sent mobile cameras out to areas where we might think there would be a likelihood of fly tipping, for example. And frankly, that's something we should be doing, but we're not at the moment. But I would have thought that that is a far more likely contingent use of these powers, to be honest. But therefore, I think the report needs amendation before we adopt it.
Mr. Rowland, would you like to come back?
I'm not aware at the moment of the mobile CCTV situation, so I would need to look into that before I can comment.
Well, I can tell you for certain that the three High Street councillors, some years ago, purchased, when we had a devolved budget, a mobile camera which is in use in High Street wards. So I don't know the details of others, but that certainly exists, and so we certainly need to look into that and incorporate.
Yeah, Mr. Rowland.
I will just add that the RIPA powers haven't been relied on by Maidstone Borough Council since 2011. So if they are being carried out covertly, then that's something I need to look at. If they are over, then that's outside of the RIPA.
These are cameras that have been used overtly, but could, in certain circumstances, be used covertly, should the council have the sense to actually start doing so again, which is outside the remit of this committee because it's a policy and operational decision. But it is a shocker that this council doesn't actually use its powers, frankly.
Yes, my understanding is that we do have those mobile cameras, as you indicate, Councillor English, but they're not used for covert monitoring, so don't fall within the scope of the powers. And had they been used for that, purpose, then obviously you would have gone through the process that's described here.
My point is it's simply factually incorrect to say that our CCTV camera system only covers the town centre and is only a fixed system. It's just factually incorrect.
Councillor Daly.
Just a query, Chairman. The inference within what I've been reading in here is that quite a lot of these things that need to be looked at in any way covertly are happening in the parishes, which infers that most of them are outside the town centre and quite a lot of them in country areas, and particularly where there's fly tipping and all the other naughtinesses that go on in country areas. That they do. But I am aware that there, most people, I say most people, a lot of people certainly these days in their cars have, or is it almost covert coverage by having in-car videos of themselves going forwards or the things coming behind, which are very useful, of course, when it comes to the point of having an insurance claim if somebody crouches up the back or in the front or dodges in front of you. So those things are available now, and very high quality, I have to tell you, by some of the images, that better than some of the things we've seen before, which are either out of focus and through a fog, usually. But the ones that are available now are small. They cost very little to buy. They cost almost nothing to run because they run on a continuous disc. So, I mean, how we deal with these covert things, I've no idea. But all it seems to me is, if it is more in the parishes, if it is, then I would hope that the parishes will take some action to do something about this themselves, in cooperation with the borough. So they have their own precepts in the parishes. They can buy a couple of cameras, I would have thought. So am I right in thinking that more of this is in the parish than in a city, in a town, shall we say?
I couldn't answer the question as to whether the number of incidents is greater in rural areas than in urban.
Councillor English, you got a comment on this?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't want to comment on the breakdown as far as Maidstone Borough Council is concerned, but it does suddenly occur to me that a number of parish councils have actually purchased, or either themselves or as part of a partnership, CCTV cameras over the years. And I just wonder, given that parish councils may be actually using these for various purposes, some of which may fall into the covert area, where whatever parish council would sit in terms of its legal responsibilities. That's one question, and because I doubt whether they've actually thought about it very much, although I could be wrong. B, I seem to remember when we were talking about the business rate retention pilots, discussions of joint working with our contractor, waste contractor, in relation to monitoring cameras on the vehicles. Is there any contingent liability on the local authority under this legislation for cameras we funded or cameras that are on our contractors' vehicles? Just a question, two questions there. Well, for the borough and one in relation to Paris.
Mr. Rowland, are you able to come back?
Chair, I'll just support my colleague. We're not able to comment precisely on the equipment that is used by parish councils, and if indeed they do undertake covert activities, as an authority they would be responsible to comply with the procedures. It doesn't fall within the borough council's authority to kind of manage their affairs. Now, in relation to CCTVs operated within the town centre and also outside of the town centre, I think page 61, paragraph 11.2, notes that the council also maintains a small amount of surveillance equipment, including 5 static cameras and noise monitoring equipment, and therefore the inspector has taken into account monitoring equipment outside of the town centre. So I think that has been addressed in this report. But in terms of specifics in relation to parish, we're not able to comment. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor English?
That wasn't, I wasn't expecting us to comment on about the specifics. My question was merely, it was a very simple one, which you've answered, thank you, as to whether the legislation applied to non-principal local authorities, and clearly it does. I would suggest that it might be wise, I mean, it's probable that these haven't been used widely for covert surveillance, but it might be worth flagging up through the next parish liaison committee that this legislation does actually apply to parish councils, and just give them a heads up and a reminder of the necessity to comply with the guidance. So that was really the burden of my question. I think the answer on the other questions is helpful, but I do still think we need to amend the report to make it clearer about the mobile systems and as opposed to the static ones. And I do think that there is a question in my mind about whether we have to comply or not, if it's equipment the council's part funded or is a contractor working on our behalf. I think it's a question that it may well be not possible to answer tonight because it's quite technical, but it's a question I would like an answer to. But not necessarily.
Chair, that further information we will review it and revert back to the councillor. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Councillor Atkinson?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I'd like to change the subject completely, and if we please to know perhaps, and discuss some of the actual wording here, because I think we should try to make these policies gender neutral. I mean, there's a glaring example on page 76, 3.4, where it says, the Chief Executive, or in her absence, his deputy. Well, that doesn't really make sense, does it? I mean, so, and throughout, yeah, that's right, and throughout, there's various things, S/HE, etc., etc. Well, that's what I'm going to say. Instead of having stuff like that, why not use they and their all the way through, and it's gender neutral, and no one could be offended, apart from perhaps pedantic grammarians, but you know, language moves on. So I think we should actually be looking at those sorts. I know it sounds trivial, but it would be consistent throughout the report. We put they and their instead of particularly that example I've just given. So hope everyone agrees. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Is that something you guys can take on board?
Yes, that's noted. I'll go back through the policy and I'll make sure it's neutral throughout.
Right, members, if there are no further... Oh, Councillor Perry?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. As you've seen from my address to you, I'm not a great fan of gender neutrality all the time, because I think some of these words are generic, but that's another here. I just want to come back to the parish council bit, actually. I'm grateful for this because it has actually reminded me that it is quite important. We've got 3 cameras, CCTV cameras, that were put in actually on advice from Maidstone Borough Council, actually, and they are supported by the police. But we have been looking, and I'm talking with a parish council hat on, looking at more covert cameras where I think this might well apply. So what I'm going to do is contact my parish clerk and make sure that we are aware of it at the parish level, because I think this is quite an important issue, actually, and we could end up tripping ourselves, over if we don't get it right. So I just want to say I'm very grateful for this, because it reminds me, and I will on a personal basis, take it up with my own parish council and follow it through. That's what I want to say. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Is this something we should follow up with other parishes as well, do you think? Do we need to get the same message out to them, as well as the one that Councillor Perry's a member of?
The suggestion has been made that we highlight the obligations to the Chairs Forum, the Parish Council Chairs Forum, so the point can be made there. So perhaps we'll provide a brief note for the forum. Thank you, Chair.
Members, if there are no other comments on this, we'll go to the recommendations on page 49. There is one recommendation with 4 parts. Do you want me to read it out, or are we happy to take it as it is on the paper? Take it all together? Okay. So taking it all together then, members, are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Moving on to agenda item 14, contract management. Mrs. Hawkes, could you introduce, please?
Thank you and good evening, members. In November 2018, contract management received a weak assurance rating as a result of an internal audit report, and I actually reported to committee at that point on the situation and where we were. Since then, I have been back again in March 2019 to report on the progress that had been made and what was planned, and I'm here again this evening to report on the progress that has been made since March 2019. And I'm pleased to report positive progress, which is always nice. So in terms of the recommendations that came from the internal audit report, all but one medium priority recommendation has been completed, and the assurance rating for contract management has now been revised from weak to sound as a result of the actions that have been taken. The actions themselves are shown at 1.4, which I've realised should be 2.4 according to the numbering system, so I do apologise for that, and that's on page 92 of your agenda. And the main improvements that I would pull out for the attention of this committee would be that the team itself, the procurement and contracts team, has been restructured to ensure that sufficient capacity can be devoted to contract management, which was really important and something that I had touched on in my report to committee last time that we were looking at it. And Simon Logan is here with me tonight. He's our interim procurement and contracts manager. And since then as well, since March, we have introduced guidance for contract management, which didn't exist before across the organisation, and nearly 15 officers have been trained in this. Obviously, there are other things there. They form part of the report. The next steps now are really to truly embed these new processes and make sure that our management of contracts is sound going forward. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Councillor Blackmore?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just following on from Councillor Perry. Wouldn't want to get it wrong. So, Madam Chairman, thank you. I can't remember my question now. Oh, it's so late in the day. I do apologise. Okay, what was my question? Oh, yes, I know. So we've gone from weak to sound, which is obviously great progress, but without meaning to be difficult, is it weak, satisfactory, sound, excellent, or is it you're just weak, or you're sound, or you're inadequate? What are the gradings, and can we improve further?
That might be an easier question for me to answer. The 4 ratings we have are poor and weak. They are the adverse ratings. Sound and strong, from bottom to top, are those ratings. Typically, with a strong rating, we look for not just adequacy in systems, but also elements of good practice. And so that's not something that we wouldn't keep going until we see the good practice. Sound is a level that the council should be perfectly satisfied with. However, contract management, like all areas of the council's business, remain in our audit universe, and we would periodically revisit the area, and we will, in due course, come back to contract management and look at it afresh, at which point it may have a strong rating. We'll wait and see. But for the purpose of correcting deficiencies, we get it up to the positive assurance level and let the service carry on from there.
Members, are there any other questions? Okay, we go to the recommendations on page 89. There is one recommendation that the progress to improve contract management corporately be noted. Members, is it noted? Noted. Agenda item 15, annual accounts 2018-19 with the update. Mr. Hartgrove, can you please introduce?
Thank you. Good evening, members. This is the update on the annual accounts audit for 2018-19 on pages 96 to 132 of the agenda tonight. The report briefly updates the committee following on the external audit work following the 30th of July audit committee, and also attaches Appendix A, Grant Thornton's updated audit findings report. Put simply, an unqualified audit opinion was issued on the 16th of August, which is unfortunately technically beyond the 31st of July deadline, with resourcing issues at Grant Thornton the primary factor in the late opinion. It's probably by way of context, it's probably worth emphasising that we were not alone in that. 40% of opinions nationally this year were late, compared to, which is a sharp increase compared to 2017-18, which was actually 13%. The only significant change to report in the audit findings report since the report was considered by the committee in July is a £3.2 million technical accounting adjustment that was required. I emphasise technical as there was no impact on council resources. It was just a case of income, primarily from the business rates pilot being taken directly to earmarked reserves when it should, in line with proper accounting practices, being credited to the income and expenditure account first and then transferred from the general fund balance. The net effect is zero, I must emphasise. It's just a technical accounting thing. And in fact, as a result of the adjustment, if you really want to be picky, we're presentationally better off the council, so that it is only a presentational thing. Grant Thornton are due to come. It's probably worth ending by just saying Grant Thornton, it's their report attached to Appendix A, and they are due to come back before this committee in November to present their annual audit letter, which will actually cover, in summary, the contents of this document. So if you've got any searching questions that we can't answer, then there'll be a second opportunity to have a go then in November. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Microphone. Could you switch your microphone off, please? Councillor Blackmore.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm slightly perturbed because we had the committee meeting the day before the final sign-off, and there was no indication at that point that there were any problems. I mean, without meaning to be rude, it seemed sort of very still waters at the time, and I feel as if someone's just lobbed a pebble in. Because I think we were left with, well, I was certainly left with the feeling, oh, okay, it's all going to be signed off tomorrow, don't worry about it. And clearly, somebody underneath the water was swimming like crazy because something was going on. I'm not suggesting there's been a cover-up or anything, but it does seem mighty odd that in the space of 24 hours, everything went awry. Please help.
Sorry, I think there's probably more for the external auditors to answer. I think the only thing I would say is that their resourcing issues were well known about from the start of the audit. They were up against the deadline, and subsequently it wasn't achieved. And that's all I can say, really. That was well, before this committee, they did sort of indicate that they were I don't know the exact words they used, I can't remember, but they were hoping to sign off the following day, and that never happened. So,
Mr. Green, would you like to come?
Yes, I'll just endorse that. We were very disappointed too, because Grant Thornton told us and the committee on the evening of the 30th that they were expecting to issue an opinion the following day. I think they had underestimated the amount of work they still needed to do, but it was very disappointing that it then took them till 16th of August finally to sign off. So I think it's perfectly fair for members to challenge Grant Thornton along those lines when they come to the next meeting.
I accept what you're saying, Mr. Green. What I find slightly difficult is we don't really have a choice of who we use, do we? And I just feel that if other authorities are in the same place, they've had theirs late signed as well, that could reflect badly on them, but it might not actually be their fault. It could be a resourcing issue caused, as we've heard from Mr. Hartgrove, by the external auditor. So I almost feel as if we're being penalised, and yet we haven't really done anything wrong. And given the fact that we have no choice, I feel we've been put in a rather difficult situation. So I think when the external auditor is here, I think there will be several questions to be asked. And I'd like to think that in the future, I'm sure this happens already, we're actually keeping a relatively tight track on them, so that, you know, we know what progress they're making. Because I'm also slightly disappointed that we didn't pick up on the fact that they were leading us, not a merry dance, but they were maybe not falsifying statements, but giving us words of comfort when there shouldn't have been any. So is that something that needs to change from our side? Do we need to be more diligent in some way?
I would say this, wouldn't I? I don't think that there's anything we could have done, because we were acting in good faith based on what they told us. Not that it's any particular reassurance, but this is part of a much wider issue that has been addressed in the local government press. But the auditors, not just Grant Thornton, other auditors who've been auditing local authorities, have clearly struggled to deliver audits with the reduced fees that they're now charging. And it's something that I'm sure will be subject to quite a lot of debate nationally over the next few months. As things stand at the moment, we're committed to Grant Thornton, but I think we would be looking for reassurances from them for next year that we're not going to go through this whole rigmarole then.
Councillor
Yeah, it's a follow-up on what Councillor Blackwell said, really. What worries me a little bit on this is not just us. It's around, there's a lot of authorities that suffer the same thing. Grant Thornton they're not the big four, but they're in the big 10 at least, aren't they? They're a major firm and should have a lot of resources. What's bothering me, actually, because auditing is not, external auditing is not a straightforward process, in my view. I'm ex-PwC, so there's an element of, dare I say this, it's based a lot on sampling, and you can't check everything in an audit. You'd be there, you'd have thousands of people doing it. So there's an element, element of trust. What worries me about it is the quality of the audit. Because if you've got a resource issue, someone says they've got a resource issue on auditing, the first thing I think of, well, how good is that audit? And that's what really, really worries me more than anything else. I won't repeat what's just been said, because I think we've all got the same concerns, I suspect. This is not a blame game, Mark. I see you're in the same position as we all are, but it is a bit worrying, so we'll have to ask Grant Thornton a few serious questions when they come. But it's just that quality issue that really does worry me. Thank you.
Councillor English.
I must have been in a different meeting, because I can't clearly remember I can't remember who it was, but I do remember that they were asked about whether they were likely to be able to sign off. So the committee did ask them, and whilst they were perhaps rather over reassuring, there was, certainly in my mind, some doubt as to whether they would actually be able to do that from what they said. I didn't leave the meeting thinking they'd offered a 100% guarantee that they would do so. So I think, you know, it is very disappointing, but I don't think that it was quite as clear-cut as presented. What I would observe is that it's not just in local government. A number of reports from leading companies in this country, and some that may not be considered leading, like JD Sports, were seriously delayed because of significant delays with their audit. And accounts were presented late, and we've listed firms. That can be actually rather more of a problem than with local authorities. So I would say this is an issue not just for local government, but right across the accounting and auditing sector in the UK, because there are significant problems being flagged up. Having said that, it's not very clear what can be done about it, because it seems to be a problem that is affecting all the leading and quite a few of the medium-sized auditing companies, and some leading companies are in a position where they can't even find an auditor at the moment, and there's no one willing to do it. So it is difficult to see what the solution is. We must, of course, try and encourage our auditors to be upfront with us and flag up and identify issues in clearer terms, perhaps. But we do, of course, as a local council, choose our auditor, but we simply chose to go through the LGA procurement route, which, of course, and we're in the first year of a contract, which was procured through the LGA. So just some background and context, but I agree we do have to press them, but I don't think it was quite as clear-cut as been presented. One observation on the report, it is encouraging, given my previous question at the previous meeting, that it appears that the McLeod decision will not be a material problem for the authority. That's reassuring.
Thank you. Councillor Atkinson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. A couple of things. Page 99, 3.5, there's this £3.5 million adjustment, which is quite a lot. Was any training given to whoever made that mistake? That's the first thing. And secondly, even if Grant Thornton had reported on time, it would still have only given the committee 1 day in which to have a look at the report. So would it be possible to change the timetable in some way, either that they report earlier to us or we delay that particular meeting so they have a chance to actually get the report in on time and give members a chance to actually read the report? So is that possible?
Mr. Green, is that something you want to comment on?
I think there's quite a few issues, Councillor Atkinson, for us to consider for next year around timing. Clearly, from our point of view, as the client, we want to make sure that we've got a reliable set of accounts ready for the auditors to look at, and we need to pin the auditors down on the timing of the audit, and finally, as you say, give sufficient time before 31st of July for proper consideration by the committee as well. So I think your point is well made.
Councillor Perry, do you want to comment on that particular point?
It is a slightly different point, but Councillor Atkinson reminded me of something. This adjustment, this I've got to put my glasses on, 3.5 million adjustment. Now, the reason is it should have gone through income and expenditure, right, which is a kind of revenue item, but it's gone straight to reserves. Is that right? That has an effect, doesn't it, on how you judge your budget and your accounts. I'm just slightly, because one's a revenue item and a reserves are a different matter, they're a balance sheet item normally. I just wanted to get an explanation on that.
The money ends up in the same place regardless of how it's accounted for. It was simply that it should have gone through the income and expenditure account in the first place under accounting standards. But the overall balance sheet position, the overall general fund position is the same, whatever treatment is taken.
Councillor Titchener.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. If I may just make a comment or an observation on page 112, the net pension liability of 77.6 million. It does say here, and it's probably perfectly in order, it says a full actuarial valuation is required every 3 years, and the latest one was completed in 2016. And the question is there one being prepared at this very moment?
Mr. Green.
Yes, a further triennial valuation will be taking place this year.
Councillor Daly, do you want to come back in?
Mr. Chairman, this is the time of the year when I always get involved with laughing at some of the language which is used in audit. I noticed, of course, we have the annual argument about unqualified and qualified. We know the difference between the two, but in accounting terms, unqualified is good. As adequate, adequate should be jolly good, but it ain't, is it? Adequate means it's passable and we enjoy it, okay. But I also like the wording in here, the primary reason for the late opinion was the exceptional resourcing pressures experienced in the external auditors. What you mean by that is you haven't got enough qualified staff. That's what it means, doesn't it? We're a bit short of people to actually do the work in time. But what I'm interested in is this. Is there, because of this slight slip behind the 31st of July to the 16th of August, is there in fact any penalty in cost? Are we going to incur a cost anywhere on this because it was late, or is it just a slap on the wrist and don't do it again?
Sorry, it's a technical breach of the regulations in the sense that the council is required to publish the opinion alongside its audited accounts by the 31st of July. So clearly that opinion didn't exist, so we were not able to comply with that. That's the first thing. In terms of additional costs, we've been, so far at least, we've not been charged any additional audit fees or anything as a result of this. So any additional costs, if they've been borne, will have been borne by the external auditors, but that's a question for them, really. I couldn't comment on what additional costs they may or may not have occurred, incurred rather. So. Sorry, yes, as Mr. Green says, that it's a national problem this year. A number of the accountancy firms, including Grant Thornton, have been suffering with resourcing problems, not having the right staff in place, the right qualified staff in place to meet their audit obligations. I know that they did have to draft in staff from other areas to try to cope with the audits in this part of the country. So there was a regional aspect to it, by the way. So.
Members, there's been lots of comments this evening about dissatisfaction with Grant Thornton. Are you happy to wait until the next meeting to speak to them directly about it, or would you like us to write a letter to them to request comments on this as of now? Okay. The recommendations for this paper are on page 96. Yep. Noted, thank you. Moving on then to page 133, agenda item 16, the budget strategy risk assessment update. Mr. Green, can you please introduce?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is the report that I bring to each meeting, updating members on risks to the budget. And there's been no change in the risks as reported here as compared to last time. The two main risks remain Brexit and future funding of local government. There has been one further development since this report was written, which members will probably be aware of, which was that the Chancellor announced next year's spending round. And that has given us a bit more certainty about next year. You probably saw that the spending announcements covered 2021. And what we now know about 2021 is that the government is assuming a council tax referendum limit of 2%, although that's still for consultation and hasn't been finally agreed yet. The business rates baseline is going to be increased by the rate of inflation. So we've got a bit more certainty for next year, but what I would say so far as the evaluation of the risks is concerned is that there is still a risk in the longer term about funding of local government. So I wouldn't propose to change the RAG rating of the risks in here, but it's only fair to mention that we do know a bit more about the position for 2021. So I'll leave it at that, but happy to take any questions that you may have on the content of the report.
Councillor Ing.
Not a question, really, merely an observation. I think that anyone who can predict the outcome of some of the risk factors here probably should be promoted to running the government of this country, because I don't know how to weigh some of these factors. So goodness knows how the Director of Finance can.
Members, in case it helps, you have got a colour copy of the risk register in front of you as well. Yep.
Yes, I agree, Councillor English. It's very difficult to form a view. I mean, what you've got here is just my view on the balance of probabilities on what the risks are. But yes, I mean, with things like Brexit, who can predict what the overall outcome will be?
Members, if there are no other comments, we'll turn to the recommendations on page 133. This report is for noting. It's noted, thank you. Turning to the final agenda item, number 17, the Internal Audit Charter. Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. What you have in front of you this evening is an update to our Internal Audit Charter. This is something that's required by public sector internal audit standards, which set out at a global level how internal audit functions, but amongst its demands is that each organisation compile an internal audit charter, setting out how those responsibilities are exercised within the context of the individual organisation. We do currently have a charter in existence that members approved previously. This is an update for clarity, for changes in standards since 2017, and one particular adjustment that I'll come to. But in general, what the Charter seeks to do is it seeks to establish the position of internal audit within the organisation, importantly clarifies our independence from management and sets out some of the safeguards of that independence and how I would go about raising any concerns of that nature. It also clarifies that the powers that we have in terms of getting hold of information and seeking explanations from officers to help us deliver our work. The one particular change that I highlight to members came out of a discussion at the previous committee where members added a fourth recommendation to my annual report, seeking to engage more closely when we delivered an adverse audit opinion. As per my previous answer to Councillor Backmore's question, that's one where we deliver a weak or a poor assurance rating, indicating there are issues unresolved in the area and it's not working as well as the council should expect it does. With respect to changes to the Charter, that's quite a straightforward small change, as I've highlighted in paragraph 8 in the Charter, the third bullet point below that, that just opens up the expectation that reports featuring an adverse assurance rating will come before this committee in full. In the covering report from section 2.6 to 2.11, I set out with a bit more, in a bit more depth, an anticipated path that those reports would take. I've opted to not put that in full in the Charter, in the expectation that there are a number of different reasons why a report might see an adverse conclusion, and these things are necessarily, I would suggest, best taken case by case, as the nature of the committee's interest and the type of involvement the committee would seek to have in tracking the recommendations through to their action would vary. But the baseline assumption would be is that a weak assurance opinion is accompanied by the officer responsible for the said area setting out to members a little background on how it came to be in this situation, but perhaps more importantly, the plans to remedy that situation and return the service to a positive assurance rating in due course. So the general expectation of the process would be is when we issue a draft at that level, I'd consult with the chair and the vice chair, let them know that a draft report at that level has been issued. Sometimes, of course, the service will come forward with additional evidence that satisfies us, in which case, usually, that report would only appear at the committee as part of its our standard updates. However, where we issue an adverse final opinion, the baseline expectation would be the report itself and a covering report setting out what the service plans to do as a result would come before the next appropriate meeting of this committee. But so I've left some discretion in there so that the committee could ask for more or less involvement if the circumstances through the chair felt that it was appropriate. Happy to take any questions from members on the Charter.
Thank you. Councillor Daly?
Yeah, well, Chairman, thank you, Rich, for the noting that the various things we did ask for, particularly the things that were a bit wobbly, will be reported in more obvious ways so that we can check on those, and thank you for that. Just one thing, have you got sufficient resource to do the job? I mean, that's the next question. I mean, are you satisfied that you've got enough resource? We're talking about qualified people to do the internal audit. I hope you have.
Thank you, Councillor Daly, and as members who attended the briefing before, I know that's a very, very pertinent and apposite question to be asked. I'm happy to say, as I set out in my plan for the year, currently we're in a strong position with respect to the depth of qualification and expertise within the internal audit team. So I'm satisfied we have it on an expertise level. With respect to a sufficiency in terms of quantum, this approach would involve a small amount of additional work in producing the reports, but I'm quite satisfied it's something we can handle without compromising any other areas of our business.
A very small fee for asking that question.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My understanding is that we are part of Mid-Kent Services, and the Mid-Kent Service team have not just Maidstone, they have other authorities. So do I take it that everybody is now subject to a new charter? This is not unique to us. Presumably everybody is having to rewrite it so that it follows the required standards that are laid down by greater beings or bodies.
That's correct. I presented an updated charter at Tunbridge Wells last week. I will be presenting one at Swale on Wednesday and on Ashford on the 1st of October.
Sounds a bit like Groundhog Day. I wish you the best of luck, Mr. Clark.
Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yes, I've read this. It's as usual, an excellent piece of work, I may say. So I just wanted to say I think we're extremely lucky to have such a strong and effective internal audit department. It's very important for the internal controls. They're a fundamental part of the internal controls of our organisation, and certainly I feel very reassured that we have a very, very good and very sound, a very strong internal audit. And thank you very much, Rich, for all your work you do and your team, because I think it's a great job of work, really do. Thank you.
Councillor English.
There are many organisations up and down the country that have charters, some better than others. Some of those organisations are not particularly great at actually putting those charters into effect. And now we've had, over the years, whether we had a charter or not, quite an effective and independent audit function. So I suppose my question is on point 7 of the report on page 152, which says just the charter will become effective once approved. So my question is, what's the plan for its lodgement, circulation and flagging up to all the relevant people, and any training that may be needed to actually ensure that everyone is fully aware of this charter and complying with it?
Thank you, Councillor English. With respect to the everyday mechanics of the audit approach, this charter makes no changes. It sets out our current practice and very much reflects the charter that this one would replace. As for how we communicate that, one of the things that we do, it's in our audit plan, we refer to the charter and the obligations it presents, but also as part of the material we provide to audit sponsors, heads of service, as we both when we do our planning at the start of the year, but also when we undertake audits, there are sort of standard paragraphs within that which seek to remind people of their obligations under the charter. I have not yet had to refer to the charter in dispute with the head of service, but that option exists also. But up till now, and long may it continue, I'm satisfied that relevant people have complied with the obligations this charter presents to them.
Yes, I'm sure that's the case. It's just that we have had a number of charters in this council's history, many of which have been very effective. But one of the problems I've observed of being a councillor for a long time, perhaps too long in some people's opinion, is that we often adopt very good, even cutting-edge policies and charters. And they are, you know, sometimes they're not necessary because we're complying with them. But institutional memory in this council and the retention of key documents has not been one of our most shining successes. And similarly, if I can turn to a document that's nothing like the audit charter, but it is a charter, and the parish charter, which was cutting edge when it was first adopted, and it described the practice at the time, but it was put in a cupboard and forgotten about, and the practice did not keep up with the charter which had described previous practice. So all I'm saying is that just because our practice is good and our charter describes our current practice, people change, organisations change, memories fade. So it may have seemed a question that was unnecessary, but given our failures of institutional memory over the decades, I think it is important to make sure that we've done everything we can to make sure that we don't ever fall into that trap again.
Thank you, Councillor English. It's one of the reasons why there is also an obligation for regular updates. And so should you still be on this committee a year from now, you will likely see a paper very similar to this. As for the quality of the charter, I thank you for your comments, but also remind you that this is the year where we have an external quality assessment, so I hope you won't just have to take my word for it in due course.
Right, members, there's no other questions. We turn to the recommendation on page 148. One recommendation that the internal audit charter be approved. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you, members. That then completes the agenda for this evening. Thank you very much for your attendance. I'll declare the meeting closed.
Just go to the webcast off and I'll be back.
Yeah.